Tantor Audio presents The Strange Case of the Rickety Cossack and Other Cautionary Tales from Human Evolution by Ian Tattersall. Narrated by Tom Perkins. Preface. I am approaching the end of a long career as a paleoanthropologist, a student of human evolution, with a nagging feeling of incompletion. Not that I would trade that career for anything. It has been hugely fulfilling and has provided me with an endless supply of incident, however unwanted on occasion, that has guaranteed the absence of boredom. Even more important, over the last half-century, profound changes in the field of paleoanthropology have made it a wonderfully exhilarating place to be. Most obvious among these are the huge additions made to the human fossil record, the traditional archive of our evolutionary past, nowadays closely rivaled by the advent of powerful molecular genetic techniques that allow us alternative ways of glimpsing our biological history. But numerous other new technologies have also given us unprecedented approaches to clarifying the ages and the life ways of our various hominid precursors, and novel viewpoints on how evolution works have offered us new ways of thinking about our biological record. Yet for all the excitement, in some respects, paleoanthropology has remained curiously static compared to other areas of paleontology. Indeed, it seems fair to say that today's paleoanthropologists are in general a lot more like their precursors of the mid-20th century than, say, modern dinosaur or fish paleontologists are. Perhaps this is inevitable, since it is particularly difficult to escape from preconception when looking at our own egocentric species, Homo sapiens, and its extinct relatives. What is more, we tend to scrutinize the evidence for our own past in considerably more detail than we do that of other species. Still, for all the extenuating circumstances, the science of human evolution has not borne the burden of history lightly. In this field, more than most, what we think today continues to be very intensely influenced by what we thought yesterday and the day before that. I realized this fact with particular force a few years ago while writing Masters of the Planet, a book in which I attempted to put together a coherent account of just how, from a remote starting point as a bipedal but otherwise unremarkable ape, we human beings contrived to become, rather rapidly, the extraordinary creatures we are. As the writing progressed, I realized that if I was to provide a narrative of human evolution that would make ready sense, I would have to omit any substantial mention of the convoluted, and in many ways highly insular, histories of discovery and ideas in paleoanthropology. This was a serious omission since, given the sheer weight of paleoanthropology's historical burden, it left a huge gap in the story. It is that gap that led to the book you are listening to now, which is in effect a complement to the earlier one. It is an idiosyncratic history of paleoanthropology that is intended to show just how received wisdoms about human evolution have always conditioned what we have believed about our own origins, often in the face of compelling evidence to the contrary. For the half-century or so during which I have actively participated in the field, I have tried to make this point by describing the development of my own ideas about evolutionary processes and about the fossil record they have produced, while enlivening the narrative with some anecdotal experience. My hope is that by the book's end I will have convinced you that how we interpret the process by which we became human really does matter, because it so greatly impacts our view of ourselves. Perhaps you will allow me to begin with what may initially appear to be a digression. Prologue. Lemurs and the Delights of Fieldwork. The sail first appeared as a tiny triangle above the shimmering horizon. Gradually it resolved into the image of a rickety dhow, butting slowly nearer through the ocean's swells. At first, though, I barely noticed it. I had other preoccupations. Sitting forlornly on a gleaming deserted beach on Moheli, the smallest of the Comoro Islands, which sit in the middle of the vast Mozambique Channel between Madagascar and Africa, I was actually wondering if I would ever see the outside world again. 3 weeks earlier I had arrived in Moroni, capital of Grand Comore Island, after one of the more hair-raising aircraft rides of my life. I had shown up early in the morning at Dar es Salaam Airport in neighboring Tanzania for the scheduled short flight aboard one of Air Comores' two ancient DC-4s. Once at the airport, I was told that Air Comores hadn't actually been seen for a month, but that if I felt optimistic, I could wait. So I waited, along with two unkempt French youths, one of whom sported a bushy golden beard and long, lank hair that made him resemble that weird image on the Shroud of Turin. Hours of desultory conversation later, a battered DC-4 with a star and crescent on its tail finally rolled up to the ramp and spluttered to a stop in the blazing midday sun. For what seemed an eternity, nothing happened. Finally, the flight to Moroni was called, and we three optimists duly trooped out to the aircraft. As we climbed the rolling steps, its door opened, emitting a blast of hot, fetid air that almost knocked us off our feet. Inside, we found a cabin crammed with heat-prostrated passengers and our way forward blocked by oil drums lashed down along the aisle. Not an empty seat in sight. We looked around at the cabin steward. He nodded at the barrels. Once we were settled uncomfortably on our improvised seats, the door closed and the aircraft taxied out. After what felt like an eternity, it staggered into the air. Circling up to a cruising altitude of what seemed no more than a couple thousand feet, we headed out over the choppy Mozambique Channel, every whitecap sharply visible below us. Arriving in Moroni, a bone-jarring landing took up the entire runway, and after we reached the terminal, it took me a while to disentangle myself from all the junk in the aircraft interior. By the time I finally got inside the tiny building, the Air Comores captain was already seated at the bar at the end of the narrow room, fiercely grasping a tumbler brimming with neat whiskey. Recognizing him from earlier times, Air Comores flight crews in those days were grizzled veterans who had flown Dien Bien Phu, Biafra, and Katanga, had seen it all and usually liked to reminisce, I greeted him warmly. He didn't respond in kind. Instead, he raised his eyes from his glass, fixed me with a wide-eyed stare, and said, "We were 2 tons over maximum gross weight on takeoff, and if one engine had so much as hiccuped, we'd all be dead." Taken aback, I said, "But, Monsieur X, why do you fly under these conditions?" His answer, "Monsieur, I am 75 years old. Who else will pay me to fly?" That was the Comoros in a nutshell. Assembled one by one into the French Empire at various dates between 1840 and 1912, the 4 tiny islands of the archipelago, Grand Comore, Moheli, Anjouan, and Mayotte, had earlier been independent sultanates lying at the far end of the Arab trading route down the East African coast from Oman. During colonial times, they were administered as a dependency of the huge but equally remote French island of Madagascar, making them about as forgotten and neglected as it's possible to be. But isolation and tranquility are not the same thing, and once Madagascar had achieved its own independence in 1960, the Comoros embarked on a tortuous history, the complexities of which have been far out of proportion to the archipelago's size. Until 1974, the islands remained under the wing of distant France, but at the end of that year, a referendum on independence was held. 3 islands voted to go it alone, but the southernmost island of Mayotte, which had been French the longest, voted to stay that way. Ultimately, this was allowed, and in response, the enraged Comorian authorities blockaded the wayward island. I was living in Mayotte at the time, and I clearly remember my growing dismay as first the beer, and then the cigarettes, and then all civilized forms of food ran out. Eventually, we were reduced to subsisting off a supremely tedious ratatouille of obscure local vegetables. When, after some months, we finally learned that a shipment of imported food had beaten the embargo and arrived in one of the island's few primitive stores, we were less than entirely amused to discover that the entire consignment consisted of cans of ratatouille niçoise. Times have changed, though. Since 2011, Mayotte has been an overseas department of France, complete with supermarkets, paved roads, high prices, a bloated bureaucracy, and a polluted lagoon. In the other Comoros, in contrast, time has in many ways stood pretty still. even if events haven't. As if to make up for a marked lack of economic progress, though, politics have been very lively indeed. Almost as soon as the archipelago had unilaterally declared its independence, its president was deposed in a coup, the first of 4, by the notorious French mercenary Bob Denard, already a veteran of mischief in Algeria, Katanga, Rhodesia, and other trouble spots. Following a short period of confusion, a revolutionary named Ali Soilih was installed as president, and things got really interesting. Ali was a Francophobe Maoist with peculiar ideas about democracy. To purge the Comoros of its colonial heritage, he supervised the burning of all the government's civil status records, and to assure his legitimacy, he reduced the voting age to 14. He was a Che Guevara-like idol to kids, a maneuver that allowed him to squeak by in a referendum on his rule. It was in the midst of all this folderol that I found myself sitting despondently on that beach in Moheli. One rarely hears anything about the Comoros in the outside world, and when I'd arrived in Moroni I had been blissfully unaware of all the chaos and mayhem going on. All I had known was that the islands were unusually hard to get to in that summer of 1977. And this is where my little fieldwork debacle becomes relevant to what I shall be writing about in the rest of this book. I had come to the Comoros to continue the studies of lemurs I had begun some years earlier in Madagascar. Lemurs, as you may know, are the primates unique to that huge island, and they are of particular interest because they last shared a common ancestor with humans around 50 million years ago. That's a pretty long time. And while the lemurs are nonetheless our cousins, it makes them remoter from us than monkeys and apes are. At the same time, while the lemurs have diversified enormously in their island redoubt, in some important respects they have remained a lot more primitive than humans have. This means that if you want to know how your own ancestors lived and functioned early in the age of mammals, it is to the lemurs you have to turn. And if, like me, unkind fate had excluded you from Madagascar, which is another story, you were out of luck, with one exception. Possibly because they were transported there by humans within the last 1,000 years or so, a couple of species of lemurs, out of well over 50, have managed to make it over to the Comoros and have established wild populations there. As a result, a lemurologist without access to Madagascar had little option but to head for the archipelago. So there I was. But the instant I stepped off the plane in Moroni, I knew I had made a huge mistake. There was a creepy feeling to the place, and the air was full of little bits of paper ash, the result I soon learned of burning all those property, birth, and marriage records. What's more, it proved hard to find any of the bureaucrats from whom I had been used to seeking permits and logistical support. So, since I knew that there were no lemurs on Grand Comore, it was clear that I should head with all dispatch to another of the islands where there were lemurs to be found, and where, in my previous experience, nothing much ever happened anyway. So much for experience. Off I went to the local Air Comores office and bought a one-way ticket to Moheli, the next island in the chain. There were no formalities on departure, but stepping off the aircraft onto the dirt strip at my destination, I found myself greeted by a couple of teenagers, one of whom was toying with a Kalashnikov. The other gave me a broad smile, introduced himself as a member of the Revolutionary Youth, and invited me to stay in the organization's hotel at an exorbitant rate. Hotel? That was something new for Moheli. Still, not for the first or the last time in my life, I had been made an offer I couldn't wisely refuse, and I joined my hosts in a military jeep driven by Kalashnikov. After a bumpy few minutes, we arrived at our destination, which turned out to be the ruins of what not long before had been the well-appointed home of an ylang-ylang plantation manager. Now it was a disaster zone. The plumbing had been ripped out, the generator and wiring had been stolen, and the roof was sagging. I was taken to a filthy room devoid of anything except rats, rubbish, and piles of old bricks, and was invited to pay a week's rent in advance. With my cash in their pockets, my hosts bid me farewell and vanished in their jeep. At this point, my state of mind was not the best. I wandered out of my hovel and walked several dusty kilometers into Fomboni, the island's main and only town. It was almost deserted, but I was able to purchase a couple of cans of Spam and some rice and matches in a ramshackle store before I returned to my grand residence. That night, Bacco Mari turned up. Bacco was a young man who had driven me around on his official motorcycle during my previous residence on Mohéli, and who was now full of deeply unsettling revolutionary fervor. Disappointingly, he informed me that the mongoose lemurs I had previously studied had disappeared from the neighborhood, as, with massive immigration of refugees, they later did from almost the entire island. Gone was any reason to remain in Mohéli. The next day thus found me at the Air Comores office, asking for a ticket to the next island, Anjouan. The agent amiably said he was willing to sell me one, but that he couldn't do so without seeing my exit visa. Exit visa? I was traveling within the same country, and nobody had asked me for an exit visa when I had left Moroni. Nonetheless, monsieur, I was assured, you need an exit visa to leave Mohéli. We cannot issue you a ticket without one. And where would I get this visa? Why, from the revolutionary youth, of course. The same evening, well after dark, I received a visit from an emissary of the dignified and courtly gentleman who had been préfet of Mohéli before independence. In hushed tones, my visitor invited me to visit the préfet at once, but warned I should not be seen for fear of reprisals on both sides. I duly sneaked over to the préfet's darkened house, where I found the former official in a state of extreme distress. He explained to me that the government had been disbanded, and that the island was now being terrorized by the submachine-gun-wielding teenagers of the revolutionary youth, Ali's version of Mao's Red Guards. Their authority was backed up by a unit of the Tanzanian military that lurked in a camp a little way along the coast. Nothing happened in Mohéli that the revolutionary youth didn't want, the préfet told me, and a lot of bad things were happening. Monsieur, he said, you have to leave as soon as possible. But to comply, I had to have that exit visa, and that meant facing the revolutionary youth. I trudged down to Famboni again and found a gaggle of 14-year-olds of both sexes chatting, smoking pot, which Ali Swali had legalized, and idly fondling an assortment of evil-looking weapons. I requested an exit visa and was immediately refused. When I asked why, the teens replied that they didn't have a rubber stamp. Logical enough, I suppose, and on my numerous subsequent visits the answer was invariably the same. So I had pretty good reasons for my despondency as that dhow hove into view. It was obvious that the youth weren't prepared to issue me my exit visa as long as they had a cash cow occupying their ruin, and I had no idea what they would do when my money was gone. Nor was I anxious to find out. It might get really ugly if I couldn't pay my rent. What's more, with no access to lemurs, I had absolutely nothing to distract me from my plight, especially after I had run out of batteries for my shortwave radio. Naturally enough, then, that dhow on the horizon became an object of particular interest. Gradually, it grew bigger, until it became clear that it was heading for the beach more or less right where I was. When it ground into the sand a few yards away from me, it disgorged a pair of very seasick figures whom I instantly recognized as my young French companions from the flight from Dar es Salaam to Moroni. They duly joined me in my slum, and next day we trooped down together to the Revolutionary Youth's headquarters. Once he had recovered from his seasickness, the Jesus figure, he of the golden beard and tumbling locks, turned out to be a charismatic character who knew intuitively just how to charm the youth. Within a few days he had the meeting out of his hand, and one of the kids eventually obtained a piece of linoleum and carefully carved an exit stamp into it. Our passports duly decorated, the three of us took the next flight to Anjouan, and eventually out to the wider world. Anyone who knows the lovely Comoro Islands and their good-natured people, a blend of African, Arab, and Malagasy influences with a dash of errant European added, must wish them a more settled and more prosperous future. But meanwhile, the outlook for the archipelago's unusual flora and fauna remains dire. When I first went to the Comoros in 1974, the total human population of all 4 islands in the archipelago was reckoned to be about 250,000. Today, just the 3 islands of the Union of the Comoros are home to 3 times that many people, maybe more. Even in Mayotte, where the environment is threatened by development rather than by poverty, there has been a marked drop in lemur numbers over the past decade. This matters because most lemur populations are under huge and increasing pressure in Madagascar. Mayotte is their only homeland controlled by a developed nation that, if it wished, could easily afford to protect them. Yet for all the neglect that has been lavished on them, the lemurs must occupy a very special place in the heart and mind of anyone interested in the long evolutionary history of humankind. This is because, as I've hinted, in certain respects they resemble our own remote ancestors of the Eocene epoch around 50 million years ago. Ranging today from animals the size of a mouse to that of a large house cat, and until not very long ago up to the size of a gorilla, lemurs have smaller brains relative to their body sizes than we higher primates do, and they depend much more on the sense of smell. Still, they are clearly not as dumb as these attributes have led many to suppose. Primate psychologists have tended to evaluate lemur intelligence using tests developed for monkeys and even people. Forms with much greater manual skills and a strong tendency to evaluate objects entirely visually rather than also by smell. This has been a huge drawback to understanding how exactly lemurs apprehend the world, and as researchers devise ways of testing the lemurs' cognitive skills in ways more appropriate to their own ways of relating to the environment around them, we can hope to gain valuable insight into the kind of cognition that preceded our own unusual way of dealing with information. In this context alone, the lemurs have an enormous amount to teach us, as they do about our ancient ancestors' social and ecological strategies. But in my own particular case, they had an even more significant lesson to impart. Most of my research nowadays is in paleoanthropology, as I try to understand the fossil and archaeological evidence for human evolution. Like all of my contemporaries in the English-speaking world, I was initially trained to look upon the biological history of the human family as a single-minded and implicitly heroic struggle from primitiveness to perfection. The going assumption when I was a graduate student was that evolution is a process of fine-tuning that, over the eons, gradually makes its subjects ever more perfectly adapted to the environments in which they live. That perspective was hardly surprising, since it intuitively appeals to members of a species that is the only representative of its group in the world today. This lonely state of ours makes it appear logical to reconstruct the story of our evolution by projecting the single species Homo sapiens back in time, in a single gradually modifying lineage. And, of course, in one very limited sense, this view is accurate, for we are certainly the product of a unique series of ancestors, each of which existed over a definable period of past time. But that is purely in hindsight. In prospect, which is how evolution works, things would have looked very different. The upshot is that what I'd been taught about human evolution was very far indeed from the whole story, and it was my involvement with lemurs, beginning in the late 1960s, that gave me my very first inkling of this. What any observer of the lemurs of Madagascar immediately notices before anything else is that they are amazingly diverse. There are way north of 50 species of these lovely primates, arrayed into 5 different families. These range from the tiny scurrying mouse lemurs to the cat-sized quadrupedal true lemurs to the long-legged leaping sifakas and lepa lemurs that typically hold their bodies vertical, to the bizarre bat-eared bushy-tailed ai. What's more, if you'd been fortunate enough to visit Madagascar a mere 2,000 years ago, you would additionally have seen the hanging sloth lemurs, the giant koala-like megalodopeds, and the vaguely monkey-like archaeolemurids, all of them weird and wonderful and much bigger than their surviving relatives. In other words, the whole lemur fauna loudly blares diversity at you. Not just diversity in body forms and lifestyles, but evolutionary diversity too, with several distinctive families, lots of genera, and huge numbers of species. What's more, it turns out that diversity, even on this eye-catching scale, is hardly unusual among successful groups of mammals. In fact, it is rather routine. Successful mammal families have a strong tendency to spread geographically, and to diversify phylogenetically. Applying this lesson from my studies of the lemurs to the very varied human fossil record, I soon realized that our own hominid family is actually no exception. Far from having been the linear perfecting process that most of us were taught about, if we were taught anything about it at all, human evolution actually witnessed high drama as one new species after another was pitchforked out into the ecological arena to do battle for survival and success, and, as likely as not, to become extinct in the process. Acknowledging this pattern of events entirely changes our perspective on how we became the highly unusual creatures we are. For it rapidly becomes apparent that we human beings are not the burnished product of incremental improvement over the eons. Instead, we are one particular outcome of an active process of experimentation, with the evidently many ways there are to be a hominid. This in turn casts considerable doubt on the received assumption that we were fine-tuned by evolution to be a creature of a particular kind. Yet because there is undeniably something very unusual about us today, so unusual indeed that our species really has radically changed its relationship to nature, it has proven very difficult for paleoanthropologists to perceive our hominid precursors as just another bunch of primates, and to see the process that produced us as merely another example of something that occurs widely among mammals. Right from the point at which it was realized, over a century and a half ago, that we have a fossil record, there has been a distinct leaning toward what one might call hominid exceptionalism, the instinctive assumption that, because we are so different today, our own ancestors did not necessarily play the evolutionary game by the same rules that apply to everything else out there. It is this vague exceptionalist feeling that accounts for the notable conservatism in paleoanthropology that I began by complaining about. In one form or another, it has existed from paleoanthropology's very earliest beginnings, where any account of our understanding of ourselves has to start. Chapter 1. Humankind's Place in Nature. We human beings have always taken who we are pretty much for granted. After all, we are so unlike the other living creatures with which we share the world that, on the face of it, there's very little room for confusion. Bizarrely, we walk upright on two legs, freeing up hands that have acquired astonishing powers to manipulate things. We lie to each other using that highly unusual medium we call language. We have vast brains, housed in skulls that are precariously balanced atop rather puny bodies, and we are not at all discomfited by our ability to entertain conflicting beliefs within those brains. We wield amazingly complex technologies without which we couldn't possibly any longer get by, and we process information in a totally unprecedented fashion. The list of our unique features is endless. Nothing else in nature looks or does business anything like us, with the result that, for most of its history, the idiosyncratic Homo sapiens has hardly seen any need to define itself. The differences between us and the other animals around us seem so obvious that, for example, back in the 18th century, the great lexicographer Samuel Johnson thought it adequate to define a man as a human being, and human as having the qualities of a man. Perhaps this was not the high point of Johnson's magisterial dictionary, but at a time when our closest known relative in nature was the poorly understood orangutan, Johnson's contemporaries hardly needed more. Certainly Johnson's equally famous contemporary Carl Linnaeus didn't. Linnaeus, the father of modern zoological classification, is revered for having taken the bold and revolutionary move of classifying us among the primates, along with the lemurs and the monkeys and the apes. But when it came to actually describing Homo sapiens, he abandoned his normal practice of listing features that would help his readers to recognize a member of a particular species if they saw one. Instead, he contented himself with the admonition, "Nosce te ipsum," know thyself. And perhaps this vagueness was entirely forgivable. After all, while we are dimly aware that we are integrated into the natural world, it is equally evident that, in some complex and occasionally unfathomable ways, we are also set apart from it. We just...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?